The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the New Mexico desert when 12-year-old Zoe Faith Sullivan heard the distinctive whir of helicopter rotors sputtering overhead, followed by an emergency landing that would shatter everything she thought. She knew about her father's death. What began as a simple act of kindness, helping billionaire defense contractor Thomas Garrett fix his grounded aircraft with skills inherited from her late father, Captain Dean Rodriguez, transformed into a moment of reckoning when Garrett's eyes fell upon the military dog tags hanging around her neck. In that instant, as recognition dawned across the powerful man's face, years of carefully buried secrets began to unravel, revealing a conspiracy that reached from the highest levels of corporate boardrooms to the sacred halls of military honor, forever changing the lives of a small-town girl and the man whose company had destroyed her family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The red dirt road leading to the Sullivan Ranch stretched endlessly under the scorching August heat, dust devils dancing across the barren landscape like ghostly sentinels. Zoe Sullivan walked with purposeful strides, her worn cowboy boots kicking up small clouds of ochre dust with each step. At 12, she possessed an unusual combination of her late father's mechanical genius and her grandmother, Ruby's fierce independence, traits that had served her well in the 3 years since Captain Dean Rodriguez's helicopter had crashed during what the military called a routine training exercise. The weight of her father's dog tags bounced gently against her chest as she walked, the metal warm from the desert sun and her own body heat. She wore them everywhere, despite Sofia Hernandez's gentle protests that they were too heavy for such a young girl's neck. But Zoe couldn't bear to be separated from the last tangible connection to the father she barely remembered, the man who existed now only in faded photographs and Sofia's carefully chosen stories. Sofia, her father's sister, and the woman who had become her guardian after her grandmother Ruby's passing last spring, was working a double shift at the diner in town. The bills never seemed to get smaller, no matter how many hours Sofia logged slinging coffee and burgers for truckers and tourists passing through Mesa Vista. Their small ranch, inherited from Ruby, provided just enough space for Sofia's beat-up pickup truck, a few scraggly chickens, and the workshop where Zoe spent most of her free time tinkering with engines and mechanical devices that other people had given up for dead. The sound reached her before she saw anything unusual, a rhythmic thudding that grew increasingly erratic, like a heartbeat struggling against failure. Zoe shaded her eyes with her hand and scanned the cloudless sky until she spotted it, a sleek black helicopter, clearly expensive, limping through the air with the desperate urgency of a wounded bird. Black smoke trailed from somewhere near the engine compartment, and the aircraft's normally steady flight pattern had deteriorated into an alarming wobble. She watched with growing concern as the pilot fought to maintain control, the helicopter losing altitude with each passing second. The ranch property extended for nearly 40 acres, mostly barren, except for the cluster of buildings near the main road, and a few stubborn cottonwood trees that Ruby had somehow coaxed to life with careful irrigation. It was the largest flat, expansive for miles, making it the logical choice for an emergency landing. The helicopter touched down hard about 200 yards from the main house, sending up a cloud of dust and debris that momentarily obscured Zoe's view. She could hear the engine winding down with mechanical groans and hisses that suggested serious problems. Without hesitation, she broke into a run toward the aircraft, her mind already cataloging possible causes for the engine failure she had witnessed. As the dust settled, Zoe could see two figures emerging from the helicopter. The pilot, a middle-aged woman in a crisp white shirt and dark sunglasses, was already circling the aircraft with professional efficiency, examining the exterior for damage. The passenger, however, stood perfectly still beside the open door, speaking rapidly into a cell phone with the commanding tone of someone accustomed to having his problems solved by others. He was tall and lean, probably in his mid-40s, with graying hair and the kind of expensive clothing that looked effortlessly casual but probably cost more than Sophia made in a month. His khaki pants and white polo shirt were wrinkled from the flight, and there was a thin sheen of perspiration on his forehead that he dabbed occasionally with a monogrammed handkerchief. Everything about him radiated wealth and authority, from his perfectly polished shoes to the way he held himself as if the world existed primarily for his convenience. "I don't care what meeting I'm supposed to be in," he was saying into the phone, his voice carrying clearly across the desert air. "We're grounded 20 miles outside some godforsaken town called Mesa Vista, and I need immediate extraction. Send another helicopter, send a car. I don't care what it costs." Zoe approached cautiously, her natural helpfulness warring with an instinctive wariness around strangers, especially wealthy strangers who looked like they might consider her families. Modest ranch, an inconvenient obstacle to their important business. She had learned from Sophia to be polite but cautious with people who clearly came from a different world. The pilot noticed her first, removing her sunglasses to reveal worried eyes. "Hey there, sweetheart," she called out with forced cheerfulness. "Don't worry, we're not hurt, just having some mechanical difficulties." The man ended his phone call with obvious frustration and turned to see what had caught his pilot's attention. His eyes swept over Zoe dismissively at first, taking in her dusty clothes, sun-weathered face, and the small toolbox she had grabbed from the porch without thinking. Then his gaze stopped abruptly, focusing with laser intensity on something that made his face go pale beneath his tan. "Where did you get those?" he asked quietly, his voice suddenly stripped of its earlier commanding tone. Zoe's hand moved instinctively to her throat, where her father's dog tags caught the afternoon light. "They were my dad's," she replied simply, unsure why this stranger's reaction felt so charged with unexpressed emotion. Thomas Garrett stared at the dog tags as if they were ghosts made manifest, his mind racing through possibilities and connections that he had spent 5 years trying to forget. The name etched into the metal was clearly visible even from several feet away. Rodriguez, Dean M. Below that, the military service number and blood type that he had seen before, in contexts that made his stomach clench with guilt and suppressed memories. "Your father," he repeated slowly, each word carefully measured. "Dean Rodriguez. He was military." It wasn't a question, and something in his tone made Zoe straighten her shoulders defensively. "Captain Dean Rodriguez," she corrected, with quiet pride. "He died in a helicopter crash 3 years ago. Training exercise, they said." The pilot, sensing the sudden tension in the air, moved closer to her passenger with concern. "Thomas, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Thomas Garrett felt as if he had, indeed, seen a ghost. More than that, he felt as if the past had reached out across time and space to grab him by the throat in the middle of the New Mexico desert. This child, this girl who couldn't be more than 12 years old, was wearing the dog tags of a man whose death Thomas had tried desperately to push from his memory. A man whose family he had wondered about during sleepless nights when his conscience wouldn't grant him peace. "I'm fine, Captain Rodriguez," he told the pilot, his voice carefully controlled. Then he turned back to Zoe with an expression that mixed curiosity with something that might have been fear. "What's your name?" "Zoe Sullivan," she replied, then added with the careful precision of someone who had learned the importance of family connections, "Zoe Faith Sullivan. Sofia Hernandez is my aunt. She takes care of me now." The pieces clicked into place in Thomas's mind with the inexorable logic of a combination lock opening. Dean Rodriguez had mentioned his daughter in his final report. the one that Thomas had read and reread until he could recite it from memory. A young girl living with her paternal grandmother in New Mexico while he completed his service obligations. The girl who would never know that her father had died trying to expose critical flaws in military equipment manufactured by Garrett Industries. "Your helicopter's got engine problems," Zoe observed, breaking into his troubled thoughts with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who understood machinery better than emotional complexities. "I can hear it from here, probably fuel contamination or a blocked filter, judging from the way the engine was coughing before you landed." Captain Rodriguez, the pilot, looked surprised at this technical assessment from such a young source. "How do you know about helicopter engines?" Zoe shrugged, a gesture that encompassed years of learning from necessity and natural aptitude. "My dad taught me about engines before he died, and my grandmother Ruby knew her way around most anything mechanical. I've been fixing things since I was old enough to hold a wrench." She gestured toward the helicopter with professional interest rather than intimidation. "If you want, I can take a look. Might be something simple that doesn't require calling in a whole repair crew." Thomas found himself in the surreal position of having his multi-million-dollar aircraft diagnosed by the daughter of a man whose death he bore partial responsibility for. The irony was not lost on him, nor was the potential for this encounter to become either a moment of redemption or a catastrophic exposure of secrets he had worked years to bury. The pilot looked to Thomas for guidance, clearly torn between professional skepticism and the practical reality that they were stranded. With no immediate rescue in sight, the nearest airport with helicopter maintenance capabilities was over an hour away, and the commercial flights from Albuquerque wouldn't get them to their destination any faster than driving. "It couldn't hurt to let her look," Captain Rodriguez said pragmatically. "If she's right about the diagnosis, we might be able to get moving again without waiting for a repair crew." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind working through implications and possibilities. This girl, Dean Rodriguez's daughter, represented both an opportunity and a danger that he was only beginning to understand. Her offer of help was innocent enough, but Thomas knew that nothing about this encounter would remain simple for long. "All right, Zoe," he said finally, surprised by how normal his voice sounded despite the emotional turbulence beneath the surface. "Show us what you can do." As Zoe approached the helicopter with confident strides, her young hands already assessing the problem with professional competence, Thomas Garrett realized that his carefully ordered world was about to be turned upside down by a 12-year-old girl wearing her dead father's dog tags in the middle of the New Mexico desert. The question was whether this encounter would finally force him to confront the truth he had been running from, or whether it would destroy everything he had built in the years since Dean Rodriguez's death. The desert wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the scent of sage and the promise of an approaching storm, both literal and metaphorical. In the distance, thunder rumbled ominously, as if the sky itself was warning of the revelations to come. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Zoe circled the helicopter with the methodical precision of a seasoned mechanic, her trained eye cataloging details that most people would miss entirely. The aircraft was a Bell 429, she noted with quiet appreciation, a sophisticated machine worth several $1 million, the kind of equipment that represented the pinnacle of civilian aviation technology. Her father had flown similar models during his service, though never anything quite this luxurious. The exterior showed minimal damage from the emergency landing, just some scuffed paint along the landing skids and a coating of New Mexico dust that dulled the aircraft's normally pristine black finish. But as Zoe moved toward the engine compartment, following the wisps of smoke that still curled from beneath the cowling, she could see evidence of more serious problems. "The smoke's not coming from a fire," she announced, crouching beside the aircraft to peer underneath. "Looks like oil leakage, probably from a compromised seal or gasket. That would explain the engine coughing you heard before landing." Captain Rodriguez joined her, clearly impressed despite herself by this young girl's confident assessment. "How can you be so sure without opening the compartment?" Zoe pointed to several specific areas where oil residue had collected on the aircraft's underside. "See how the oil pattern spreads? It's not just dripping straight down like it would from a simple leak. It's being blown back by air pressure, which means it's coming from somewhere in the pressurized system. Probably started as a small problem but got worse as you flew." Thomas watched this exchange with growing amazement and unease. This child possessed technical knowledge that rivaled some of his company's junior engineers, and her casual familiarity with military aircraft suggested that her father had indeed shared significant expertise with her before his death. The implications of this realization settled over him like a heavy blanket of responsibility and guilt. "My dad always said that engines tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen," Zoe continued, running her hands along the helicopter's frame with surprising gentleness. "He taught me to look for patterns, not just individual problems. Everything connects to everything else." The mention of her father sent another jolt of recognition through Thomas. Dean Rodriguez had written almost identical words in one of his final reports, the one that had detailed systematic problems with engine seals in military helicopters manufactured under contract by Garrett Industries. The report that Thomas had received just 3 days before Dean's fatal crash. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man," Thomas said carefully, testing the waters of this conversation while trying to gauge how much Zoe might know about the circumstances of Dean's death. A shadow of loss passed across Zoe's young face, quickly replaced by the fierce pride that seemed to be her default response to mentions of her father. "He was the best pilot in his squadron," she said simply. "Everyone said so. That's why it was so weird when they said he crashed during a routine training flight. Dad could fly anything, even in bad weather or with equipment problems." Captain Rodriguez glanced sharply at Thomas, recognizing the dangerous territory this conversation was entering. As his personal pilot for the past 3 years, she had learned to read the subtle signs of his discomfort, and right now, every line of his body suggested a man walking through a minefield. "Accidents happen even to the best pilots," Captain Rodriguez offered diplomatically. "Sometimes it's just mechanical failure that nobody could have prevented." Zoe's expression hardened slightly, the look of someone who had heard too many platitudes and grown suspicious of easy explanations. "That's what they told Sophia. Equipment failure, they said. But Dad always taught me that good equipment doesn't just fail for no reason. There's always a cause, always something that could have been prevented if people were paying attention." Thomas felt the weight of her words like physical blows. She was 12 years old, but she was asking exactly the right questions. The same questions that had haunted him for 3 years. The questions he had tried to silence with charitable donations and anonymous support for military families, as if money could somehow balance the scales of responsibility. "Let me get my tools," Zoe said, apparently finished with her external examination. "I need to open the engine compartment to see what we're really dealing with." She jogged toward the small house, her dog tags catching the sunlight with each step. Thomas watched her go, his mind churning with memories and implications. When she disappeared through the front door, he turned to find Captain Rodriguez studying him with unconcealed concern. "Thomas," she said quietly, "you look like you're about to have a heart attack. What's going on? Who was this girl's father?" Thomas loosened his tie, suddenly feeling suffocated by the desert heat and the weight of secrets he had carried alone for too long. Dean Rodriguez was a helicopter pilot stationed at Kirtland Air Force Base. He filed several reports about problems with engine components in military aircraft. Problems with components manufactured by our company, Captain Rodriguez said, her voice flat with understanding. Thomas nodded grimly. He was scheduled to testify before a congressional committee about systematic defects he had identified. 3 days before his testimony, his helicopter crashed during what was supposed to be a routine training flight. The pilot absorbed this information with the grim professionalism of someone who understood the implications immediately. "And you think his crash wasn't accidental?" "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that there were people who had strong financial incentives to prevent his testimony, people who stood to lose millions in defense contracts if his allegations were proven true." Captain Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, watching the house where Zoe had disappeared. Was he right about the defects? Thomas's silence was answer. Enough. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years of suppressed guilt. Dean Rodriguez was a better engineer than half our design team. His reports were thorough, detailed, and absolutely correct. The problems he identified could have been fixed easily and cheaply, but fixing them would have required admitting they existed in the first place. And admitting they existed would have cost your company how much? Potentially hundreds of millions in retrofit costs, legal settlements, and lost contracts, Thomas replied. Enough to destroy Garrett Industries and bankrupt several subsidiary companies. The front door of the house opened, and Zoe emerged, carrying a well-organized toolbox that looked both professional and well-used. She had changed from her school clothes into coveralls that were clearly intended for serious mechanical work, and she had tied her long hair back in a practical ponytail. The transformation was remarkable. She looked like a miniature version of a seasoned aircraft mechanic. "Those aren't toys," Captain Rodriguez observed as Zoe approached with her equipment. "They belong to my grandmother Ruby," Zoe explained, setting the toolbox down beside the helicopter. She was an aircraft mechanic during World War II, worked on bombers at the training base in Alamogordo. Dad said she could fix anything that flew, and she taught him everything she knew before. She passed. Thomas felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. This girl came from a family of aviation experts, people who understood aircraft systems at a level that most civilians never reached. Her technical knowledge wasn't just inherited talent. It was generational expertise passed down through careful teaching and hands-on experience. "My dad always said that the best way to honor family traditions was to keep learning," Zoe continued, as she opened her toolbox to reveal an impressive array of specialized tools, many of them clearly vintage, but maintained in perfect condition. "Ruby taught Dad, Dad taught me, and someday I'll teach someone else." She selected a specific wrench and moved toward the helicopter's engine compartment with confident purpose. "Now let's see what's really wrong with your machine." As Zoe began the careful process of opening the engine cowling, Thomas found himself caught between admiration for her skill and growing anxiety about where this encounter might lead. This girl represented everything he had tried to forget about Dean Rodriguez's death. The technical expertise, the passionate commitment to aviation, safety, and the unwavering belief that problems could be solved if people were willing to face them honestly. "The access panel here is designed to come off easily," Zoe narrated as she worked, apparently accustomed to explaining her process to observers. "Military helicopters have similar setups, though they're usually built more ruggedly than civilian models." She removed the panel with practiced efficiency, revealing the complex maze of components that comprise the helicopter's engine system. Almost immediately, she pointed to a specific area where oil residue had collected around a particular component. "There's your problem," she announced with satisfaction. "The seal around this fuel injection module has failed. It's not a catastrophic. Failure, but it's definitely causing the oil contamination that made your engine smoke. Captain Rodriguez leaned in to examine Zoe's diagnosis, her professional expertise allowing her to verify the accuracy of the assessment. "She's absolutely right," she confirmed to Thomas. "It's a relatively minor problem, but one that could have gotten much worse if we had kept flying." Thomas moved closer to see what Zoe had discovered, and his blood ran cold as he recognized the component she was indicating. It was a fuel injection module manufactured by Garrett Industries, part of a series that Dean Rodriguez had specifically identified as prone to premature seal failure in his final reports. "Is this fixable?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. Despite the emotional turmoil beneath the surface, Zoe nodded confidently. "The seal itself needs to be replaced, and we'll need to clean out all the contaminated oil from the system. It's not a complicated repair, but it requires the right parts and about 2 hours of careful work." She looked up at Thomas with the direct gaze of someone who had learned to assess problems without flinching. "The question is whether you want a temporary fix that will get you flying again, or a proper repair that will prevent this from happening again. Because if this seal failed once, it might fail again, unless we address the underlying cause." Thomas stared at this 12-year-old girl who was unknowingly describing the exact problem that had killed her father, offering solutions that his company's engineers had dismissed as too expensive to implement. The irony was almost unbearable. Dean Rodriguez's daughter was now trying to fix a problem that her father had died attempting to expose. "What would a proper repair involve?" he asked, knowing that he was stepping further into dangerous territory. But unable to stop himself, Zoe considered the question with the seriousness of a professional consultant. "Well, this particular component has a design flaw that makes the seals prone to failure under certain pressure conditions. My dad wrote about similar problems in his reports. The fix isn't complicated. You just need to upgrade to a better seal, design and modify the pressure relief system slightly." Thomas felt the world tilt around him as this child casually referenced her father's work. Work that had been buried along with Dean Rodriguez himself. "Your father wrote reports about these components?" "Oh yes," Zoe replied, returning her attention to the helicopter's engine. "He kept copies of everything at home. Sophia has them all in a file cabinet now. Dad always said that documentation was the key to fixing systematic problems. You had to keep records so that patterns would become visible over time." Captain Rodriguez caught Thomas's eye over Zoe's head, her expression conveying both warning and growing understanding. They were standing at the edge of a revelation that could change everything, and neither of them was certain whether they were prepared for the consequences of what they might discover. The desert wind picked up again, carrying with it the distant rumble of thunder from clouds that were beginning to gather on the horizon. The approaching storm seemed to mirror the emotional tempest that was building around this unlikely encounter between a billionaire defense contractor and the daughter of the man whose death he had tried so hard to forget. The sound of Sofia Hernandez's pickup truck approaching cut through the desert air like a blade, its engine's familiar rattle audible long before the vehicle itself became visible through the heat shimmer. Zoe looked up from her work on the helicopter, wiping oil-stained hands on a rag as she watched the dust cloud that announced her aunt's early return from town. "That's Sophia," Zoe explained to Thomas and Captain Rodriguez. "She must have gotten off work early. She's going to want to know why there's a helicopter in our yard." Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he watched the battered pickup truck draw closer. Every instinct told him to make excuses and leave immediately, to extract himself from this situation before it became any more complicated. But the helicopter's engine lay partially disassembled around them, and Zoe had already committed to making the repairs that would get them airborne again. The pickup truck pulled to a stop near the house, its engine dieseling for a few seconds before finally falling silent. The woman who emerged was in her late 30s, with the lean build and weathered hands of someone who worked physically demanding jobs to make ends meet. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her uniform from the Mesa Vista diner bore the stains and wrinkles of a long shift serving coffee and cleaning tables. Sofia Hernandez took in the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The expensive helicopter, the well-dressed strangers, and her niece kneeling. Besides sophisticated machinery, with tools spread around her like a professional mechanic. Her expression shifted from curiosity to wariness as she approached the group. "Zoe, what's going on here?" Sofia asked, her voice carrying the tone of a guardian who had learned to be suspicious of unexpected developments in their carefully ordered life. Their helicopter had engine problems and had to make an emergency landing, Zoe explained, gesturing toward the aircraft. "I'm helping them fix it. The fuel injection module seal failed, just like Dad wrote about in his reports." Sofia's eyes sharpened at the mention of Dean's reports, and Thomas caught the subtle tension that entered her posture. She moved closer to examine the strangers more carefully, her gaze lingering on Thomas's expensive clothing and obvious wealth. "I'm Thomas Garrett," he said, extending his hand with what he hoped was an appropriately humble demeanor. "This is Captain Rodriguez, my pilot. We're very grateful for your niece's help. She's remarkably skilled." Sofia shook his hand briefly, her grip firm but her expression remaining guarded. "Garrett," she repeated thoughtfully. "That name sounds familiar. Are you in business around here?" Thomas felt Captain Rodriguez's warning glance and chose his words carefully. "I have business interests in the Southwest, yes. Defense contracting. Primarily." The change in Sofia's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. Her jaw tightened, and she stepped closer to Zoe with protective instincts that needed no explanation. "Defense contracting," she repeated flatly. "What kind of defense contracting?" "We manufacture components for military aircraft," Thomas replied, already knowing that this conversation was heading toward dangerous territory. Among other things, Sofia's eyes moved to the partially disassembled helicopter engine, then back to Thomas with growing suspicion. "Components like that one?" she asked, pointing to the failed fuel injection module that Zoe had identified as the source of their problems. Thomas nodded reluctantly, watching as Sofia processed the implications with the quick intelligence of someone who had learned to be skeptical of coincidences. "Yes, that particular component is manufactured by one of our subsidiary companies." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken accusations and growing tension. Zoe looked between the adults, sensing the shift in atmosphere, but not yet. Understanding its source, Captain Rodriguez remained diplomatically quiet, recognizing that anything she said might only make the situation more volatile. "Sofia," Zoe said finally, breaking the uncomfortable silence. "Mr. Garrett's helicopter has the same kind of fuel injection problems that Dad identified in his reports, the ones he was working on before he died." Sofia's face went pale, and she moved even closer to Zoe with instincts that were purely protective. "What exactly did you tell them about your father's reports?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Just that Dad documented similar problems with these components," Zoe replied, apparently oblivious to the growing tension. "I thought they might want to know about the design flaws Dad identified. You know, so they could fix them properly instead of just patching the symptoms." Thomas watched Sofia's expression shift from suspicion to something approaching alarm as she realized how much her niece had inadvertently revealed. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications that none of them were quite ready. The voice openly, "Perhaps we should discuss this inside," Sofia said finally, her tone making it clear that this was not a suggestion. "Zoe, you can finish working on their helicopter later. Right now, we need to talk." The small house felt even more cramped, with 4 adults and 1 child gathered in the modest living room. Thomas found himself surrounded by photographs of military, Service and family gatherings, images that told the story of lives dedicated to service and sacrifice. On the mantelpiece sat a folded American flag in a triangular display case, accompanied by Dean Rodriguez's military portrait in dress uniform. Sophia disappeared into the kitchen briefly, returning with a coffee pot and mismatched mugs that she distributed with the automatic hospitality of someone raised to offer refreshment to guests, even unwelcome ones. The ritual gave everyone a few minutes to consider their positions and choose their words carefully. "Mr. Garrett," Sophia began once. Everyone was seated. "I want you to understand something about this family. Dean Rodriguez was my brother-in-law, but he was also my best friend and the finest man I've ever known. When he died, he left behind a daughter who worshipped him and a collection of reports that he believed could save other pilots' lives." Thomas set down his coffee mug, his hands not quite steady. "Mrs. Hernandez, I want you to know that I have the deepest respect for your brother-in-law's service and sacrifice." "That's very nice," Sophia replied coolly, "but respect doesn't fix the problems he died trying to expose." Dean spent months documenting systematic failures in military aircraft components. He believed that pilots were dying because companies were cutting corners on safety to maximize profits. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a fire that threatened to spread beyond control. Thomas felt the weight of 3 years' worth of suppressed guilt pressing down on him as he met Sophia's steady gaze. "Your brother-in-law's reports were thorough and professional," Thomas admitted quietly. "His findings were concerning enough to kill him." Sophia asked bluntly, her voice cutting through diplomatic niceties with surgical precision. Captain Rodriguez drew in a sharp breath, recognizing that the conversation had just crossed a line from which there might be no return. Zoe looked confused, glancing between the adults as she tried to understand the undercurrents of accusation and guilt that were swirling around her. "Sophia," Zoe said uncertainly, "what are you talking about? Dad died in an accident. The Air Force said his helicopter had mechanical problems." Sophia's expression softened as she looked at her niece, the fierce protectiveness in her eyes, tempered by obvious love and concern. "Sweetheart, sometimes accidents aren't really accidents. Sometimes they happen because people don't fix problems they know about." Thomas felt as if he were watching himself from a great distance as he made a decision that would change everything. "Zoe," he said quietly, "your father's helicopter crashed because of the same kind of component failure you've been working on today, a fuel injection module seal that failed during flight, causing engine failure at an altitude where recovery was impossible." The silence that followed was deafening. Zoe stared at Thomas with growing understanding, her young mind connecting dots that adults had tried to keep separate. Sophia's hands clenched into fists, and Captain Rodriguez looked as if she wanted to disappear entirely. "You knew," Zoe whispered, her voice barely audible. "You knew about the problems Dad found, and you didn't fix them." Thomas nodded slowly, feeling as if each word was costing him something irreplaceable. "Your father filed his reports with my company 3 weeks before his crash. Our engineers confirmed his findings, but the decision was made to delay implementing fixes until after the current production contracts were fulfilled." "Delay," Sophia repeated, her voice thick with barely controlled anger. "You delayed fixing problems that were killing pilots because it would have cost you money. The corporate decision was made at levels above my direct authority," Thomas replied, knowing how inadequate that sounded even as he said it. "But yes, financial considerations were cited as the primary reason for postponing the modifications your brother-in-law recommended." Zoe stood up abruptly, her young face reflecting a mixture of grief, anger, and betrayal that was painful to witness. "My dad died because you were too cheap to fix something you knew was broken?" The simple, direct question cut through every justification and rationalization that Thomas had constructed over the past 3 years. Faced with this child's devastating honesty, all his corporate explanations crumbled into meaningless dust. "Yes," he said finally, "that's exactly what happened." Captain Rodriguez stood up quickly, recognizing that the situation was spiraling beyond anyone's ability to control. "Thomas, perhaps we should—" "No," Thomas interrupted, his voice gaining strength as he finally confronted the truth he had been avoiding. "No more, perhaps. No more corporate diplomacy. This girl deserves to know the truth about what happened. To her father." He turned back to Zoe, meeting her eyes with the honesty she had demanded. "Dean Rodriguez died because Garrett Industries chose profits over pilot safety. He died because men like me decided that quarterly earnings were more important than fixing known defects. He died because we thought we could manage the risk instead of eliminating it." The room was absolutely silent, except for the sound of wind, beginning to pick up outside as the approaching storm drew nearer. In the distance, thunder rumbled with increasing frequency, as if the sky itself was responding to the emotional tempest that had been unleashed in the small living room. Sophia reached for Zoe, pulling her close with the fierce protectiveness of someone who had already lost too much to corporate indifference. "And now what?" she asked Thomas. "Now that you've admitted what your company did, what happens next?" Thomas looked around the room, taking in the military memorabilia, the photographs of a man who had died trying to do the right thing, and the faces of the family he had left behind. For the first time in 3 years, he saw a path forward that didn't involve running from the truth. "Now," he said slowly, "we fix it. All of it. Not just your helicopter engine, but everything your father tried to expose. And we make sure that no other pilot dies because of problems we know how to prevent." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, striking the desert floor with the promise of a storm that would wash the air clean and leave everything changed in its wake. The rain had begun in earnest by the time they moved back outside to complete the helicopter repairs, fat droplets turning the red desert dust into streaks of rust-colored mud. Zoe worked with renewed intensity, her movements sharp and focused as she channeled her emotional turmoil into the familiar comfort of mechanical precision. The revelation about her father's death had transformed what had begun as a simple act of kindness into something far more complex and urgent. Thomas watched her work with a mixture of admiration and growing unease. This 12-year-old girl possessed not only her father's technical expertise, but also his moral clarity, and she was applying both to a problem that could potentially expose decades of corporate malfeasance. Every component she examined, every seal she tested, represented another piece of evidence in a case that could destroy everything he had built. "The contamination is worse than I initially thought," Zoe announced, her voice carrying none of its earlier friendliness. She had withdrawn into professional distance, treating Thomas and Captain Rodriguez as clients rather than guests. The failed seal allowed metal particles to circulate through the entire lubrication system. We'll need to flush everything and replace multiple filters. Sophia stood nearby, under the covered porch, watching the proceedings with sharp attention to every detail. She had changed from her diner uniform into jeans and a work shirt, and her hair was now covered by a bandana that gave her the appearance of someone preparing for serious business. In her hands was a thick manila folder that she held like a weapon. "How long will the repairs take?" Captain Rodriguez asked, glancing nervously at the darkening sky as thunder rolled across the desert with increasing frequency. "About 3 hours if we do it properly," Zoe replied without looking up from her work. "Less if you just want to get flying again without fixing the underlying problems. But then this will just happen again in a few weeks or months." The parallel to the larger situation was not lost on anyone present. Thomas recognized the choice being offered: quick fixes that would allow him to escape this encounter with minimal, immediate consequences, or comprehensive solutions that would address systematic problems but require confronting difficult truths. "We do it properly," he said firmly, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "Whatever it takes, we fix it right." Zoe glanced at him sharply, her expression unreadable. Fixing it right means admitting that the design is flawed from the beginning. It means acknowledging that this component should never have been approved for use in military aircraft without additional safety modifications. Thomas nodded slowly. "Then that's what we acknowledge." Sophia stepped forward from the porch, her folder clutched in her hands like evidence in a trial. "Before we go any further with repairs or acknowledgements," she said, her voice carrying the weight of 3 years of suppressed anger, "I think you need to see exactly what Dean documented before he died." She opened the folder to reveal a meticulously organized collection of technical reports, photographs, and correspondence. The papers were arranged chronologically, telling the story of a dedicated pilot's growing concern about systematic safety problems in military aviation. "Dean didn't just file reports with your company," Sophia continued, spreading the documents across a small table she had dragged onto the porch. "He kept copies of everything, along with his own research and analysis. He knew that corporate promises to look into problems often resulted in documents disappearing and issues being forgotten." Thomas approached the table with the reluctance of a man walking toward his own execution. The first document was a formal incident report dated 18 months before Dean's death, describing a near-catastrophic engine failure during a training exercise. The pilot had managed to auto-rotate to safety, but post-flight analysis had revealed the same type of fuel injection module failure that Zoe was now repairing. "This was the first incident Dean personally witnessed," Sophia explained, pointing to specific passages in the report. "But it wasn't the first time this type of failure had occurred. Dean started researching, requesting maintenance records from other bases, talking to pilots and mechanics across the Southwest." Captain Rodriguez leaned over Thomas's shoulder to examine the documents, her professional interest overriding her earlier discomfort with the situation. "These are incredibly detailed," she observed. "This level of analysis would have taken months to compile." 7 months, Sophia confirmed. Dean spent every off-duty hour he could spare documenting patterns of failure, identifying common factors, and developing recommendations for fixes. He believed that systematic problems required systematic solutions. Zoe paused in her work to listen to the conversation, her hands still holding specialized tools, but her attention focused on learning more about her father's final mission. "What kind of patterns did he find?" she asked. Sophia turned to a section of the folder that contained charts and graphs hand-drawn by Dean Rodriguez. "The failures weren't random," she explained. "They occurred most frequently in aircraft that had been in service for specific time periods, under particular stress conditions, and in certain environmental situations." Dean identified what he called failure windows, combinations of factors that made catastrophic component failure almost inevitable. Thomas stared at the charts with growing horror as he recognized the thoroughness of Dean's analysis. This wasn't the work of a disgruntled pilot filing complaints. This was engineering research of the highest caliber, conducted by someone who understood both the technical and human costs of equipment failure. "He sent preliminary findings to Garrett Industries in January," Sophia continued, flipping to a section of correspondence. The response was a form letter thanking him for his input and assuring him that the company took all safety concerns seriously. She pulled out a copy of Dean's follow-up letter, a document that Thomas remembered reading with growing discomfort 3 years earlier. In precise professional language, Dean had outlined specific modifications that could prevent future failures. estimated implementation costs, and requested a timeline for corrective action. The second response came 6 weeks later, Sophia said, her voice growing bitter. Another form letter, this time suggesting that Dean's concerns might be better addressed through proper military channels rather than direct corporate communication. Thomas closed his eyes, remembering the internal discussions that had followed Dean's reports. The engineering department had confirmed his findings within days, but the legal and financial departments had argued for delay, suggesting that acknowledging known defects could expose the company to massive liability claims from previous incidents. By March, Dean had identified a pattern that he found deeply disturbing, Sophia continued, turning to a section of the folder that contained newspaper clippings and official accident reports. Military helicopter crashes that had been attributed to pilot error or equipment failure showed clear signs of the systematic problems he had documented. She spread out a series of documents that painted a chilling picture of institutional indifference to pilot safety. Crash after crash, investigation after investigation, official conclusions that attributed fatal accidents to everything except the systematic component failures that Dean had identified. 7 pilots dead in 18 months, Sophia said quietly. All flying aircraft equipped with components manufactured by companies owned or contracted by Garrett Industries. All crashes occurring within the failure windows that Dean had predicted. Zoe had stopped working entirely now, her attention focused on her aunt's recitation of facts that painted a picture of her father as something approaching a prophet of aviation safety. "Dad knew this was going to happen?" she asked, her voice small with the weight of understanding. "He knew that without immediate action, more pilots would die," Sophia confirmed. "That's why he requested permission to testify before the Congressional Committee investigating military aviation safety. He believed that public testimony was the only way to force immediate action." Captain Rodriguez looked up from the documents with professional concern. "When was he scheduled to testify?" "April 15th, Sophia replied. "He crashed on April 12th during what was supposed to be his final training flight before traveling to Washington." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that none of them wanted to voice directly. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too neat, the consequences too favorable to those who had the most to lose from Dean's testimony. Thomas felt as if he was standing at the edge of an abyss, staring down into depths of corporate corruption that he had suspected but never fully confronted. "The crash investigation," he said slowly. "What were the official findings?" Sophia's expression hardened as she pulled out the final section of documents. "Pilot error," she said flatly. "The investigation concluded that Captain Rodriguez had exceeded recommended operational parameters during a routine training exercise, resulting in equipment failure and subsequent loss of aircraft and pilot." She handed Thomas the official report, a document that he realized he had never read despite having received copies through corporate channels. The conclusions were damning to Dean's reputation while carefully avoiding any suggestion of systematic equipment problems. "Pilot error," Zoe repeated, her voice reflecting growing anger. "They said my dad made mistakes that killed him." The report concluded that Dean had pushed his aircraft beyond safe limits, Sophia explained gently, despite the fact that his flight plan had been approved by his commanding officer and fell well within standard operational parameters for that type of mission. Thomas scanned the crash investigation report with growing dismay, recognizing the familiar pattern of institutional responsibility deflection that he had seen in countless corporate legal strategies. Every conclusion pointed away from equipment failure and toward human error, despite evidence that should have raised serious questions about component reliability. "There's more," Sophia said, reaching for a small envelope that had been tucked into the back of the folder. Dean recorded a message 3 days before his death. He asked me to keep it safe and share it only if something happened to him. She produced a small digital recorder, its silver surface worn from handling. He suspected that his investigation had attracted unwelcome attention. He wanted to make sure that his findings would survive even if he didn't. Thomas stared at the recorder, as if it were a snake poised to strike. Everything about this situation had spiraled far beyond his ability to control or contain, and he sensed that whatever Dean Rodriguez had recorded would make retreat impossible. Perhaps, Captain Rodriguez suggested quietly, we should focus on completing the helicopter repairs. These larger issues are— No, Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying newfound resolve. These larger issues are exactly what we need to address. Play the recording. Sophia looked at him searchingly, as if trying to determine whether his newfound commitment to truth was genuine or simply another form of corporate manipulation. Finally, she pressed the play button, and Dean Rodriguez's voice filled the air with the clarity of someone speaking from beyond the grave. The dead pilot's words would prove more dangerous to Garrett Industries than any congressional investigation, more damaging than any lawsuit, and more powerful than any corporate damage. Control strategy. As the first sentences emerged from the small speaker, Thomas realized that his old life had just ended, and whatever came next would be built on the foundation of truth that Dean Rodriguez had died trying to establish. The voice that emerged from the small recorder carried the measured tone of a man who understood that he might be speaking his final words. Dean Rodriguez's voice was clear and professional, but underneath the formal delivery was an undercurrent of urgency that made everyone lean closer to catch every syllable. If you're hearing this recording, Dean began, then something has happened to prevent me from completing my mission to expose systematic safety violations in military aircraft manufacturing. This message is my final report, intended for my family and anyone else who might be in a position to continue the work I can no longer finish. Zoe's hand moved instinctively to her father's dog tags, her young face reflecting the complex emotions of hearing her father's voice for the first time since his death. Sophia reached over to squeeze her niece's shoulder, offering silent support as they prepared to hear Dean's final testament. Today is April 9th, the recording continued. In 6 days, I'm scheduled to testify before the House Subcommittee on Military Aviation Safety. My testimony will present evidence of systematic component failures that have resulted in at least 7 preventable deaths in the past 18 months. These failures could be eliminated with design modifications costing less than $50 per aircraft. Thomas felt his chest tighten as Dean's voice laid out the case with devastating precision. The dollar amount was particularly damning, $50 per aircraft to save lives, an investment that Garrett Industries had refused to make because it would have required acknowledging liability for previous failures. The primary obstacle to implementing these life-saving modifications, Dean continued, is not technical complexity or excessive cost. The obstacle is corporate resistance to admitting that known design flaws have been allowed to remain in production, because correcting them would expose companies to legal liability for past incidents. Captain Rodriguez glanced at Thomas, watching his face as Dean's words cut through every rationalization and corporate justification with surgical precision. The dead pilot was speaking directly to the moral choices that had led to his own death, choices made in boardrooms by people who would never face the consequences of their decisions. I have documented proof that Garrett Industries and its subsidiary manufacturers have been aware of these design flaws for over 2 years. Dean's voice continued relentlessly. Internal company communications, which I obtained through official channels, show that corporate executives made deliberate decisions to delay safety modifications in order to avoid financial liability. Sophia leaned forward, her attention focused on every word as her brother-in-law's voice revealed the depth of his investigation. This was information she had never heard before, evidence that Dean had kept hidden even from his own family to protect them from potential retaliation. My research has identified a network of defense contractors who have coordinated their responses to safety concerns, sharing legal strategies to minimize liability while continuing to produce defective components. This is not a case of isolated corporate negligence. This is systematic conspiracy to prioritize profits over pilot safety. Zoe looked up at Thomas with eyes that seemed far older than her 12 years. "Is that true?" she asked quietly. "Did your company work with other companies to hide these problems?" Thomas nodded slowly, his throat tight with the weight of confession. "Yes, there were industry coordination meetings, shared legal strategies, common approaches to managing liability. Exposure, we called it best practices for regulatory compliance, but it was exactly what your father described." The recording continued, Dean's voice growing more urgent as he detailed the scope of the conspiracy he had uncovered. The coordination extends beyond simple information sharing. Companies have actively collaborated to discredit pilots who report safety concerns, to influence accident investigations, and to pressure military procurement officers to continue purchasing defective equipment. "How?" Sophia asked, her voice sharp with anger. "How did they discredit pilots?" Dean's answer came through the recorder as if he had heard her question across the years. "Pilots who file persistent safety reports are subjected to additional psychological evaluations, questioned about their fitness for duty, and sometimes reassigned to non-flying positions. The message to other pilots is clear: raising safety concerns will damage your career." Captain Rodriguez absorbed this information with the grim recognition of someone who understood how institutional pressure could silence dissent. "That explains why more pilots didn't come forward," she said quietly. "They were afraid of retaliation." "The most disturbing aspect of this conspiracy," Dean's voice continued, "is the manipulation of accident investigations. I have obtained communications showing coordination between defense contractors and military investigators to ensure that crash reports attribute failures to pilot error rather than equipment defects." Thomas closed his eyes, remembering conversations he had tried to forget about the importance of managing narrative outcomes in crash investigations. Corporate legal departments had developed sophisticated strategies for influencing official conclusions without directly interfering with investigative processes. "My own situation has become increasingly precarious," Dean continued, his voice taking on a more personal tone. "In the past 2 weeks, I have been subjected to surprise fitness evaluations, questioned about my mental stability, and warned that my testimony to Congress might be considered a violation of military confidentiality protocols." Zoe's eyes filled with tears as she heard her father describe the pressure he had faced in his final days. "They were trying to stop him," she whispered. "They were trying to make him seem crazy so nobody would believe him. 3 days ago," Dean's voice said, confirming Zoe's understanding, "I was informed that my congressional testimony had been indefinitely postponed due to questions about the reliability of my technical analysis. This postponement came after my commanding officer received calls from Pentagon officials questioning my fitness for duty." Sophia's hands clenched into fists as she listened to her brother-in-law describe the systematic campaign to discredit him. "They destroyed his reputation before they killed him," she said bitterly. "They made sure that even if he survived, nobody would believe anything he said." The recording continued, with Dean's voice growing more resolute as he outlined his final plans. I have made copies of all documentation and hidden them in multiple secure locations. If something happens to me, these records will serve as evidence of both the technical problems I identified and the conspiracy to suppress solutions. Tomorrow, I will attempt one final flight test to gather additional data about component failure patterns under operational stress. This test will push aircraft systems to their limits, but within approved parameters. If the equipment fails as I predict it will, the resulting data should provide irrefutable proof of the design flaws I have identified. Captain Rodriguez understood immediately what Dean had planned to do. He was going to deliberately stress the faulty components to demonstrate the failure pattern, she said with professional admiration. It was brilliant. Create a controlled failure that would provide undeniable evidence. But they knew what he was planning, Thomas said quietly, the full horror of the situation becoming clear to him. Someone had access to his flight plans and understood what he was trying to prove. Dean's voice provided the confirmation they all dreaded. I have reason to believe that my communications are being monitored and my flight plans are being shared with unauthorized personnel. If this test flight results in catastrophic failure, it will not be an accident. It will be murder disguised as pilot error. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain intensifying outside and thunder rolling across the desert with increasing frequency. The approaching storm seemed to mirror the emotional tempest that Dean's final message had unleashed upon his family and the man whose company had destroyed him. If I do not survive this mission, Dean concluded, I want my daughter Zoe to know that everything I did was to make flying safer for the pilots who come after me. I want her to understand that sometimes the most important battles are fought, not in the sky, but in the pursuit of truth against those who would hide it for profit. His voice softened as he spoke directly to the daughter he would never see grow up. Zoe, you have inherited your grandmother's gift for understanding machines and fixing things that others consider beyond repair. Use that gift to build a better world than the one I'm leaving you. Never let anyone convince you that safety must be sacrificed for convenience or profit. The recording ended with Dean's final words. The truth is in the documents. The proof is in the patterns. Justice depends on courage. I love you all. The small recorder fell silent, leaving the 4 adults and 1 child sitting in the gathering. Darkness, as rain drummed against the roof with increasing intensity. Outside, lightning began to flash across the desert sky, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark moments of clarity that seemed to mirror the revelations they had just experienced. Zoe was the first to speak, her young voice carrying a determination that echoed her father's courage. We have to finish what he started, she said simply. We have to make sure other pilots don't die because of problems we know how to fix. Thomas looked at this remarkable child who had inherited not only her father's mechanical genius, but also his moral clarity. And he realized that his choice was no longer between corporate survival and personal conscience. Dean Rodriguez had posthumously made that choice for him by documenting the full scope of the conspiracy with irrefutable precision. Yes, Thomas said quietly. We finish what he started. All of it. Outside, the storm was building toward its full fury, promising to wash the desert clean and leave everything changed in its wake. Inside the small house, 4 people committed themselves to a mission that would either bring justice for Dean Rodriguez and the pilots who had died after him, or destroy them all in the attempt. The helicopter repairs were no longer just about fixing a mechanical problem. They had become the first step in a much larger campaign to honor the memory of a man who had died trying to save lives that corporate greed had deemed expendable. The storm reached its full intensity as they returned to work on the helicopter, rain driving horizontally across the desert in sheets that turned the air itself into a wall of water. But the urgency of their mission had transformed what had begun as a simple repair job into something approaching a sacred duty. Zoe worked with renewed focus, her small hands moving with precision despite the challenging conditions, while the adults held umbrellas and tarps to protect the exposed engine components from the deluge. "The lubrication system is completely contaminated," Zoe announced over the sound of wind and rain, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her true calling. "We need to drain everything, flush the lines, and replace not just the failed seal, but also the backup systems that should have prevented this kind of cascading failure." Thomas watched her work with growing amazement, recognizing that this child possessed the same combination of technical expertise and systematic thinking that had made her father such a formidable investigator. Every component she examined, every system she tested, revealed additional evidence of the cost-cutting measures that had prioritized profit margins over pilot safety. "How much of this helicopter's engine would need to be modified to meet your father's safety recommendations?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious about the scope of changes that proper engineering would require. Zoe paused in her work to consider the question with the seriousness it deserved. "About 30% of the fuel and lubrication systems would need upgrades or replacements," she replied. "Most of the modifications are simple. Better seals, redundant backup systems, improved monitoring equipment. The expensive part isn't the components themselves, it's admitting that the current design is inadequate." Sophia looked up from where she was organizing Dean's documents under a protective tarp, her expression reflecting both pride and concern as she watched her niece demonstrate expertise that rivaled professional mechanics twice her age. "Zoe, sweetheart, maybe you should let the adults handle the more complex repairs." "I can do it," Zoe replied with quiet confidence. "Dad taught me that understanding a problem completely is more important than having fancy credentials. And I understand this problem better than anyone here, except maybe Mr. Garrett, who helped create it in the first place." The accusation was delivered without malice, but its directness cut through the rain and wind like a blade. Thomas accepted it, without flinching, recognizing that this remarkable child had earned the right to hold him accountable for his company's failures. "You're absolutely right," he admitted, "and that's exactly why I need to understand every detail of what you're doing here. When we expose this conspiracy, I want to be able to explain not just what went wrong, but how it should have been done correctly from the beginning." Captain Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the proceedings while staying in radio contact with air traffic control, approached the group with news that added urgency to their mission. "Thomas, I just received a call from your executive assistant. The board of directors has called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. They're asking about our whereabouts and demanding immediate updates on our status." Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he realized that their prolonged absence had triggered exactly the kind of corporate attention they could least afford at this critical moment. "What did you tell them?" "That we experienced mechanical difficulties and were awaiting parts," Captain Rodriguez replied. "But they seemed unusually persistent. Edward Drake specifically asked whether we had made contact with any local personnel during our emergency landing." Sophia's head snapped up at the mention of that name, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "Edward Drake? He called personally?" Thomas nodded, puzzled by Sophia's reaction. "You know Drake?" "He was one of the people who contacted my brother-in-law's commanding officer in the weeks before Dean's death," Sophia explained, pulling out a section of Dean's documents that she had organized by corporate contact information. Dean documented several calls from Garrett Industries executives to military personnel, questioning his reliability and suggesting that his safety reports might be motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns. She located the specific document she was seeking and handed it to Thomas, pointing to a transcript of a phone conversation that Dean had somehow obtained. Drake personally called Colonel Foster, Dean's commanding officer, to suggest that Dean might be suffering from stress-related mental health issues that were affecting his judgment. Thomas read the transcript with growing horror, recognizing Edward Drake's voice in the manipulative language designed to undermine Dean's credibility without making direct accusations. The conversation was a masterpiece of corporate character. Assassination, planting seeds of doubt about Dean's mental stability while maintaining plausible deniability about any coordinated effort to silence him. If Drake is asking about local contacts, Captain Rodriguez said quietly, it suggests that someone has been monitoring our communications or tracking our location. They may already know more about this situation than we realize. Zoe looked. Up from the helicopter engine, oil stains on her coveralls, mixing with rainwater to create abstract patterns that somehow made her look even more professional. How long before they send people to check on you directly? Thomas considered the question with the strategic thinking that had made him successful in corporate environments, now applied to the problem of evading corporate surveillance. Probably within hours. Drake doesn't make calls like that unless he's already implementing containment strategies. Then we need to work faster, Sophia said decisively. And we need to make sure that all of Dean's evidence is secured before anyone arrives who might want to make it disappear. She began organizing the documents into multiple sets, creating redundant copies of the most critical evidence while explaining her process to the others. Dean always said that information only has power if it can't be destroyed by people who want to bury it. We need to make sure that multiple copies of everything end up in different hands. Zoe continued working on the helicopter with increased urgency, her young hands moving with the confidence of someone who had found her calling in the intersection of mechanical precision and moral purpose. The engine should be ready to test. In about an hour, she announced. But Mr. Garrett, before you fly away from here, you need to decide what you're actually going to do with everything you've learned. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Thomas recognized that this 12-year-old girl was asking him to make a choice that would define not only his own future, but potentially the safety of countless military pilots whose lives depended on the integrity of the equipment they flew. "I'm going to do what your father would have done," Thomas replied, surprised by the certainty in his own voice. "I'm going to tell the truth, regardless of the consequences to myself or my company." That's easy to say when you're standing in a storm in the middle of nowhere, Sophia observed with the skepticism of someone who had learned not to trust promises from wealthy men. It's harder to remember when you're back in boardrooms surrounded by lawyers and accountants who explain all the reasons why truth-telling would be catastrophically expensive. Thomas met her challenging gaze directly, recognizing that she was testing his resolve in the same way that Dean had probably tested the reliability of aircraft components, by applying stress until weaknesses became apparent. "Then help me remember," he said simply. "Come with me. Bring Dean's evidence. Make sure I don't lose my courage when the pressure starts building. We can't just show up at corporate headquarters with a 12-year-old girl and start making accusations," Captain Rodriguez pointed out practically. "There are procedures, protocols, legal considerations that could undermine the effectiveness of any evidence we present." Zoe wiped her hands on a rag and stood up to face the adults with the direct gaze that seemed to be a family trait. "My Dad didn't worry about procedures when pilots were dying," she said matter-of-factly. "He worried about doing the right thing in the most effective way possible." She gestured toward the partially repaired helicopter, its sophisticated technology now exposed and vulnerable in the desert storm. This machine represents millions of dollars of engineering and manufacturing, but right now, it's broken because people made decisions based on profit instead of safety. We can fix this one helicopter, but the same problems exist in hundreds of other aircraft that are flying right now with pilots who don't know they're at risk. Thomas found himself humbled by the moral clarity of this remarkable child who had inherited not only her father's technical skills, but also his ability to see through complex situations to their essential moral core. What do you think we should do? Zoe considered the question with the seriousness of someone who understood that her answer might affect the lives of people she would never meet. "We finish fixing your helicopter," she said finally. "But we don't fix it the quick way that just patches the problem. We fix it the right way, so that it becomes an example of how all these aircraft should be modified." She looked around at the adults, her young face reflecting a determination that seemed far beyond her years. "Then we take this helicopter and all of Dad's evidence, and we go find someone who has the power to make the changes that need to happen, not just in your company, but in all the companies that have been putting profits ahead of pilot safety." "The Congressional Committee," Sophia said suddenly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "The same committee that Dean was supposed to testify before. They're still investigating military aviation safety, and they still need evidence of systematic problems in defense contracting." Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing the elegance of the solution that Zoe had proposed. "We go to Washington. We bring the helicopter as physical evidence of the problems and the solutions. We bring Dean's documentation as proof of the conspiracy to hide those problems. And we demand that Congress force industry-wide implementation of the safety modifications that should have been made years ago." Captain Rodriguez looked skeptical about the practical challenges of such a plan. "And when Garrett Industries tries to discredit all of us the same way they discredited Dean Rodriguez, when they claim that a 12-year-old girl and a disgruntled executive aren't reliable sources of technical information." And Zoe smiled for the first time since learning the truth about her father's death, her expression reflecting a combination of her father's courage and her grandmother's practical wisdom. "Then we let the helicopter speak for itself," she said simply. "We demonstrate the problems and the solutions in front of cameras and congressional representatives who can't be bought or intimidated. We make it impossible for anyone to claim that the evidence isn't real." The storm was beginning to show signs of weakening, with longer intervals between lightning flashes and a gradual reduction in the driving rain. As the immediate fury of the weather passed, the four conspirators found themselves committed to a mission that would either honor Dean Rodriguez's sacrifice by exposing the truth he died trying to reveal, or destroy them all in the attempt. But as they worked together to complete the helicopter repairs that would carry them toward an uncertain future, each of them understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. Dean Rodriguez had proven that truth was worth dying for. Now his daughter and her unlikely allies would discover whether it was also worth living for. The helicopter's engine turned over smoothly on the first attempt, its rebuilt systems humming with the precision that only comes from proper engineering and careful assembly. Zoe stepped back from the aircraft with the satisfaction of someone who had not only fixed a problem, but had transformed it into something better than its original design. The modifications she had implemented went far beyond simple repairs. They represented a complete reimagining of how military aircraft safety systems should function. "All readings are nominal," Captain Rodriguez announced from the pilot's seat. running through her pre-flight checklist with professional thoroughness. Engine temperature stable, oil pressure optimal, all warning systems responding correctly. This aircraft is actually flying better than it was before the emergency landing. Thomas watched Zoe wipe her hands on a shop rag, marveling at how this 12-year-old girl had not only diagnosed and repaired complex mechanical problems, but had also engineered improvements that his company's best technicians had never considered implementing. The irony was not lost on him. Dean Rodriguez's daughter had just demonstrated the exact solutions that could have prevented her father's death. "The modifications you made," Thomas said to Zoe, "could they be applied to other aircraft of this type?" Zoe nodded confidently. "The principles are universal. Better seals, redundant backup systems, improved monitoring equipment. These aren't complex innovations. They're just common sense engineering that prioritizes safety over cost savings." Sophia emerged from the house carrying 3 sets of documents sealed in waterproof containers, along with a small suitcase that contained personal items and additional evidence that Dean had hidden throughout their home. Her expression reflected the grim determination of someone preparing for a battle that would determine whether her brother-in-law's sacrifice had meaning or would be buried, along with the truth he had died trying to expose. "I've contacted my supervisor at the diner," Sophia announced. "Told her I have a family emergency and won't be back for at least a week. And I've arranged for the neighbors to look after the ranch while we're gone." Captain Rodriguez looked up from her flight preparations with practical concern. "Sophia, are you certain you want to do this? Once we leave here, there's no turning back. If Garrett Industries decides to retaliate against you personally, your life could become very difficult very quickly." Sophia's laugh was bitter but not without humor. "My life became difficult 3 years ago when they killed my brother-in-law and left me to raise his daughter on a waitress's salary. The question isn't whether they'll retaliate. It's whether we're going to let them keep getting away with murder." The sound of vehicles approaching cut through their conversation like a knife, the distant rumble of multiple engines growing steadily louder as they navigated the muddy ranch road. Thomas felt his pulse quicken as he recognized the implications. Corporate damage control had arrived faster than any of them had anticipated. "How many vehicles?" Zoe asked, her voice steady despite the obvious danger. Captain Rodriguez climbed higher in the helicopter to get a better view of the approaching convoy. 3 black SUVs, she reported grimly. Professional drivers, government plates. This isn't a casual visit. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities and contingencies, his corporate experience providing insight into the kind of resources that Edward Drake could mobilize when containing potential threats to company interests. "They'll have legal authority to confiscate evidence, court orders to prevent us from leaving, and probably surveillance equipment to monitor everything we say or do." Sophia secured the last of the document containers in the helicopter's cargo compartment, her movements quick and efficient despite the approaching danger. "Then we leave now, before they get close enough to stop us." "Wait," Zoe said suddenly, running toward the workshop behind the main house. "There's something else we need." She emerged moments later carrying a metal case that she handled with obvious reverence. "Dad's flight recorder," she explained breathlessly. He installed a personal backup system in his helicopter, separate from the official equipment. Sophia found it in the wreckage and kept it all these years. Thomas stared at the case as if it contained explosives rather than electronic equipment. His personal flight recorder from the crash? "Everything from his final flight," Sophia confirmed, helping Zoe secure the case in the helicopter. The official recorders were mysteriously damaged in the crash, but Dean's backup system survived. We never had the technical expertise to analyze the data ourselves. The approaching vehicles were close enough now that individual engines could be distinguished, their coordinated movements suggesting the kind of tactical precision that went far beyond normal corporate security procedures. Captain Rodriguez was already bringing the helicopter's systems online, the rotor blades beginning their slow rotation as she prepared for immediate departure. "Everyone aboard," she commanded with military efficiency. "We have maybe 2 minutes before they're in position to prevent takeoff." Thomas helped Sophia and Zoe into the helicopter, his mind still reeling from the revelation about Dean's personal flight recorder. If that device contained data from Dean's final flight, it could provide irrefutable proof of whether his crash had been caused by mechanical failure or deliberate sabotage. As the helicopter lifted off, Thomas caught sight of the approaching convoy through the passenger window. The vehicles had reached the ranch entrance and were accelerating toward the house with the urgency of people who knew their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. In the lead SUV, he could make out figures in business suits speaking rapidly into communication devices. Edward Drake's damage control team, arriving too late to prevent the very exposure they had been sent to suppress. "Where are we heading?" Captain Rodriguez asked over the helicopter's communication system as they gained altitude and turned toward the east. "Washington, D.C., Thomas replied firmly. "The congressional committee that Dean was supposed to testify before is still conducting hearings. Representative Sarah Martinez chairs the House Subcommittee on Military Aviation Safety, and she's been pushing for increased oversight of defense contractors." Zoe looked down at the ranch growing smaller beneath them, her expression reflecting a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she left the only home she had ever known to pursue a mission that her father had died attempting to complete. "Will they believe us?" she asked quietly. Thomas followed her gaze to the desert landscape below, recognizing that they were all leaving behind the safety of anonymity for the dangerous prominence of whistleblowing against one of the most powerful defense contractors in the country. "They'll believe the evidence," he said with more confidence than he felt. "Your father documented everything too thoroughly for anyone to dismiss his findings as unreliable." Sophia opened one of the waterproof containers and began organizing documents for easy access, her systematic approach reflecting years of helping Dean prepare his reports. "We need to think strategically about how we present this information," she said. "Corporate lawyers will try to discredit us personally before anyone examines the technical evidence." "What kind of attack should we expect?" Captain Rodriguez asked, her pilot training extending to tactical thinking about non-aviation threats. Thomas considered the question with the insider knowledge of someone who had participated in corporate damage control strategies, though never at this level of moral complexity. "They'll claim I'm a disgruntled executive attempting to damage my own company for personal gain. They'll suggest that Sophia is motivated by grief and looking for someone to blame for her brother-in-law's death. And they'll argue that Zoe is too young to understand the technical complexities she's discussing. And the evidence itself?" Sophia asked. "They'll claim the documents were fabricated, that the flight recorder data was tampered with, and that the helicopter modifications we made were unnecessary improvements to systems that were already functioning properly," Thomas replied grimly. "Corporate legal departments have standard playbooks for discrediting whistleblowers, and they're very effective." Zoe looked up from where she was studying her father's flight recorder, her expression reflecting the determined intelligence that seemed to define the Rodriguez family. "Then we don't give them time to organize their attacks," she said simply. "We present the evidence publicly before they can control the narrative." Captain Rodriguez adjusted their flight path slightly, navigating around weather systems while maintaining optimal fuel efficiency for the long journey to Washington. "How do we ensure public presentation? Congressional hearings can be closed." "To media if national security concerns are raised," Thomas smiled grimly as he recognized the tactical thinking that this remarkable child had inherited from her military father. "We don't wait for official hearings," he said. "We go directly to the media first, create public pressure that makes it politically impossible for anyone to suppress congressional investigation." As the helicopter flew steadily eastward through the clearing night sky, the four unlikely conspirators continued planning their campaign to expose the truth that Dean Rodriguez had died attempting to reveal. Below them, the landscape changed from desert to farmland to industrial centers, each mile taking them closer to a confrontation that would either validate Dean's sacrifice or destroy everyone who had dared to challenge corporate power. The personal flight recorder sat secured among Dean's other evidence, its electronic memory containing secrets that had remained hidden for 3 years. Soon, that data would either prove that Captain Dean Rodriguez had died a hero's death, exposing corporate corruption, or it would be dismissed as the fabricated evidence of grieving family members seeking someone to blame for a tragic accident. But as Zoe held the device that contained her father's final moments, she felt certain that truth had a power that corporate lawyers could not overcome. Dean Rodriguez had taught her that machines did not lie. They simply recorded reality and waited for someone skilled enough to interpret their testimony. Tomorrow, her father would finally get his chance to testify before Congress, speaking through the evidence he had gathered and the daughter who had inherited his passion for aviation safety. The question was whether anyone in power would have the courage to listen to what the dead pilot had to say. The lights of Washington, D.C. appeared on the horizon as dawn broke across the eastern seaboard, the nation's capital emerging from darkness, like a promise of justice that had sustained them through the long night flight. Captain Rodriguez had navigated with precision through multiple air traffic control zones, carefully avoiding military airspace while maintaining the steady progress that would bring them to their destination before the business day began. Zoe had spent much of the flight studying her father's personal flight recorder, connecting the device to a tablet computer that Sophia had brought along. Her young face was illuminated by the screen's glow as she worked through data files that contained the electronic testimony of a dead pilot, information that had waited 3 years for someone with the technical knowledge to interpret its meaning. "The data is all here," Zoe announced quietly, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and grief as she uncovered her father's final moments. Every system reading from his helicopter during the last flight, engine performance, stress measurements, component temperatures, even cockpit audio recordings that he made while flying. Thomas leaned over to examine the tablet screen, recognizing some of the technical readouts from his own company's engineering reports. The data painted a detailed picture of aircraft performance during the minutes leading up to Dean's crash, information that had apparently been preserved despite official claims that flight recorders had been too damaged to provide useful evidence. "What do the readings show?" Sophia asked, her voice carefully controlled despite the emotional weight of learning exactly how her brother-in-law had died. Zoe's fingers moved across the tablet screen with the confidence of someone who had inherited generational expertise. In aviation systems, Dad was testing the fuel injection modules under maximum stress conditions, just like he said he would in his final recording. The data shows that he was flying within all approved parameters, but he was deliberately pushing the systems to their operational limits. She paused to point out specific readings that showed systematic component deterioration during the flight. Here, you can see the first seal failure occurring at 14 minutes into the flight. Engine temperature spiked briefly, then stabilized as backup systems engaged, but Dad kept flying, collecting data on how the failure progressed. Captain Rodriguez monitored their approach to Washington while listening to Zoe's analysis, her professional understanding of aviation systems allowing her to appreciate the technical sophistication of Dean's final investigation. He was documenting the failure cascade in real time, she observed with obvious admiration, creating a complete record of how component failures led to catastrophic system breakdown. The audio recordings are the most damning evidence, Zoe continued, accessing files that contained Dean's voice during his final flight. He was narrating everything he observed, describing each failure as it occurred and explaining how proper design modifications could have prevented the problems. She activated the audio playback, and Dean Rodriguez's voice filled the helicopter cabin with the calm professionalism of a pilot conducting a scientific experiment under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. His words were precisely chosen, clearly intended for an audience of engineers and investigators who would analyze his findings after his death. Flight test, minute 16, Dean's recorded voice said with characteristic precision. Primary fuel. Injection seal has failed completely, causing oil contamination throughout the lubrication system. Backup systems are functioning, but stress readings indicate that secondary failures are imminent. This failure pattern matches exactly the scenarios I documented in my safety reports to Garrett Industries. Thomas closed his eyes as he listened to Dean's posthumous testimony, recognizing the devastating accuracy of observations that proved Dean had died trying to create irrefutable evidence of the design flaws his corporate employers had refused to acknowledge. Minute 18, Dean's voice continued relentlessly. Secondary seal failure confirmed. Engine performance degrading rapidly, but still within emergency operational parameters. If proper modifications had been implemented, redundant systems would have prevented this cascade failure entirely. The cost of these modifications would have been approximately $53 per aircraft. Sophia reached for Zoe's hand as they listened to Dean's final minutes, his voice remaining steady and professional even as his aircraft systems failed around him. He stayed focused on the mission, she whispered with obvious pride. Even knowing he was going to die, he kept collecting evidence. Minute 21. Dean's recorded voice said with growing urgency, multiple system failures occurring simultaneously. Auto-rotation procedures initiated, but altitude insufficient for safe. The landing. This crash could have been prevented with design modifications that Garrett Industries has possessed the technical capability to implement for over 2 years. The audio recording ended with the sound of impact, followed by electronic silence. That seemed to echo through the helicopter cabin long after the playback had stopped. Zoe turned off the tablet and sat quietly for a moment, processing the emotional weight of hearing her father's final words combined with the technical triumph of his successful documentation of corporate negligence. That recording is going to destroy Garrett Industries, Captain Rodriguez said quietly. No jury in the world would conclude that crash was pilot error after hearing Dean's real-time analysis of systematic component failures. Thomas nodded grimly, recognizing that his former life was about to end as completely as if he had died in the crash alongside Dean Rodriguez. The legal liability alone will bankrupt the company, he agreed, but more importantly, it will force industry-wide changes that will save lives. As they approached Ronald Reagan National Airport, Captain Rodriguez made contact with air traffic control to arrange landing clearance for their unscheduled arrival. The early morning flight traffic was light, giving them flexibility to land without extensive delays that might provide time for corporate interference. Once we're on the ground, Thomas said, we'll have maybe an hour before Garrett Industries mobilizes every legal resource available to prevent this information from becoming public. We need to move fast and present evidence to multiple audiences simultaneously. Sophia organized the document sets they had prepared during the flight, creating separate packages for congressional representatives, media outlets, and military oversight agencies. Dean always said that information warfare required multiple simultaneous attacks to prevent any single point of failure, she explained. If they can stop one investigation, they can't stop them all. Zoe secured her father's flight recorder in a protective case, recognizing that the device now represented the most powerful weapon in their arsenal against corporate cover-ups. "Where do we go first?" she asked practically. "Congress or the media?" Thomas considered the tactical implications of their various options, drawing on corporate strategic thinking, now applied to the problem of exposing corporate corruption. "We go to Representative Martinez first," he decided. "Get congressional protection for our evidence before we make it public. Then we hold a press conference where we demonstrate the helicopter modifications and play Dean's flight recording. For media coverage, the helicopter touched down at a private aviation facility near the airport, where Thomas's corporate connections provided access to ground transportation and temporary security. As they disembarked with their evidence and equipment, each member of the group understood that they were crossing a point of no return in their mission to honor Dean Rodriguez's sacrifice. Within hours, the comfortable anonymity that had protected them during their journey would be replaced by the harsh scrutiny of national media attention and corporate retaliation. Zoe would become the public face of military aviation safety reform. Sophia would emerge as an advocate for families affected by defense contractor negligence, and Thomas would transform from corporate executive to industry whistleblower. But as they prepared to enter the corridors of power where Dean Rodriguez had planned to testify 3 years earlier, none of them questioned whether the personal cost was worth the potential benefit. Dean's flight recorder had provided them with evidence that could prevent future tragedies, and his daughter had given them the technical expertise to explain complex problems in terms that politicians and journalists could understand. The battle for aviation safety reform was about to begin in earnest, fought with weapons that Dean Rodriguez had forged in the final moments of his life, and carried forward by the unlikely alliance of people who had found each other in a New Mexico desert. Storm, congressional hearings, media investigations, and legal proceedings would determine whether Dean's sacrifice had been meaningless or had created the foundation for systematic change that would save countless lives. As they walked toward the terminal, building where their public mission would begin, Zoe carried her father's flight recorder with the reverence of someone bearing a sacred relic. Soon, Dean Rodriguez would finally get his chance to testify before Congress, speaking through the electronic evidence that had preserved his voice across 3 years of corporate silence. The question was whether the powerful interests that had silenced him once would find a way to silence him again, or whether the truth he had died to preserve would prove stronger than the money and influence arrayed against it. The marble corridors of the Rayburn House office building echoed with the measured footsteps of 4 people carrying evidence that would reshape military aviation safety forever. Representative Sarah Martinez had agreed to meet them before the formal business day began, recognizing from Thomas's urgent phone call that they possessed information critical to her ongoing investigation into defense contractor accountability. Zoe walked beside Sophia with quiet confidence, her father's flight recorder secured in a protective case that she carried like a sacred trust. At 12 years old, she was about to become the youngest person ever to provide technical testimony to a congressional subcommittee. But her demeanor reflected the calm professionalism that seemed to define the Rodriguez family approach to crisis. Management, Representative Martinez has been fighting for aviation safety reform for 3 years, Thomas explained as they approached the Congresswoman's office. She was the one who originally requested Dean's testimony, and she's never accepted. The official explanation of his crash. The door opened before they could knock, revealing a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the direct gaze of someone accustomed to confronting powerful interests on behalf of people who had no other advocates. Representative Martinez greeted them with the focused attention of someone who understood that this meeting could provide the breakthrough her investigation had been seeking. "Mr. Garrett," she said, extending her hand with professional courtesy that masked obvious curiosity about why a defense contractor CEO was arriving unannounced with a family she recognized from constituent correspondence. "Mrs. Hernandez, I've read your letters about Captain Rodriguez, and you must be Zoe." The Congresswoman's office was filled with photographs of military aircraft and memorial tributes to service members who had died in aviation accidents, creating an environment that honored the human cost of the technical failures they had come to discuss. Zoe felt immediately comfortable in this space, recognizing that Representative Martinez understood the connection between engineering decisions and pilot safety. "Representative Martinez," Sophia began, "we have evidence that Captain Rodriguez's death was not an accident. We have proof that he was murdered to prevent his congressional testimony about systematic safety violations in military aircraft manufacturing." The Congresswoman's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention as Sophia placed the first set of documents on her desk. "These are technical reports that Dean compiled over 7 months of investigation. They document patterns of component failure that have resulted in multiple pilot deaths, all of which could have been prevented with design modifications costing less than $60 per aircraft." Thomas stepped forward with obvious reluctance, his corporate instincts warring with his newfound commitment to truth. "Representative Martinez, I need to confess that Garrett Industries received Captain Rodriguez's reports and chose to suppress his findings rather than implement the safety modifications he recommended." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that would reverberate through defense contracting, military procurement, and congressional oversight for years to come. Representative Martinez examined Thomas with the calculating gaze of someone who understood that his admission represented either a breakthrough in her investigation or an elaborate attempt at damage control. "Why are you coming forward now?" she asked directly. "What changed to make you willing to testify against your own company?" Zoe placed her father's flight recorder on the congressman's desk with ceremonial precision. "Because my father's voice is finally ready to testify," she said simply, "and because the same problems that killed him are still killing other pilots." Over the next hour, they presented evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of corporate conspiracy, regulatory capture, and institutional indifference to pilot safety. Dean's documentation proved systematic patterns of component failure, while his personal flight recorder provided irrefutable testimony about the technical causes of his death. Most powerful was the audio recording of Dean's final flight, his calm voice providing real-time analysis of system failures while his aircraft disintegrated around him. Representative Martinez listened with growing anger as Dean's posthumous testimony demolished every aspect of the official investigation that had blamed his death on pilot error. "This evidence will trigger multiple congressional investigations," Representative Martinez said after reviewing the complete package of documentation. "Criminal referrals to the Justice Department, military oversight hearings, and probably reorganization of defense procurement procedures." She looked directly at Thomas with the stern expression of someone who had spent her career holding powerful people accountable for their decisions. Mr. Garrett, you understand that your testimony will likely result in criminal charges against multiple executives at your company, including potentially yourself. Thomas nodded slowly, recognizing that his old life had ended the moment he chose truth over corporate loyalty. I understand the consequences, he replied, but I also understand that preventing future deaths is more important than protecting my personal interests or corporate profits. Within hours, the corridors of congressional power were buzzing with news that would dominate aviation safety discussions for months to come. Representative Martinez had called emergency hearings of the House Subcommittee on Military Aviation Safety, while Senate oversight committees prepared parallel investigations into defense contractor accountability. The press conference that followed drew national media attention to issues that had been buried in technical reports and classified briefings for years. Zoe stood beside the modified helicopter that they had flown from New Mexico, explaining in clear, simple language how proper engineering could prevent the component failures that had killed her father and multiple other pilots. My dad always taught me that machines don't lie, she said to the assembled reporters and cameras. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. The problem isn't that we don't know how to fix these safety issues. The problem is that some people care more about money than about the pilots who risked their lives defending our country. Her technical demonstration of the helicopter modifications drew gasps from audience members who could see the stark difference between corporate cost-cutting and proper safety engineering. Components that had been designed to fail were replaced with systems that provided redundant protection, while monitoring equipment displayed real-time data about aircraft health that could prevent cascading failures. Sophia stood nearby with Dean's flight recorder, playing selected portions of his final testimony for journalists who had never heard a pilot's real-time analysis of the technical failures that were killing him. The contrast between Dean's professional competence and the official investigation's conclusions created a narrative that no corporate public relations strategy could counter. Thomas faced the most difficult questions from reporters who wanted to understand how a defense contractor CEO had become a whistleblower against his own industry. His answers were direct and uncompromising, acknowledging years of corporate decisions that had prioritized profits over pilot safety, while expressing his commitment to supporting comprehensive industry reform. The immediate aftermath was swift and devastating for Garrett Industries. Stock prices collapsed as investors recognized the scope of legal liability facing the company, while government contracts were suspended pending investigation of safety violations. Edward Drake and other executives found themselves facing congressional subpoenas and Justice Department scrutiny that would ultimately result in criminal prosecutions. But the longer-term consequences were even more significant. Congressional hearings led to mandatory safety modifications across the defense industry, while new oversight procedures ensured that pilot safety reports could not be suppressed or ignored by corporate interests. The total cost of implementing Dean's recommended modifications was less than the amount Garrett Industries spent on executive compensation in a single year. 6 months later, Zoe stood in the renovated workshop behind their New Mexico ranch house, working on aircraft components for a new company that Thomas had established to manufacture safety modifications for military helicopters. The business was small but growing, serving clients who valued engineering integrity over profit margins. Sophia had used her portion of the whistleblower settlement to establish the Captain Dean Rodriguez Foundation for Aviation Safety, providing scholarships for military families and supporting research into systematic safety improvements. The foundation's headquarters occupied a building adjacent to the congressional offices, where Dean had planned to testify 3 years earlier. Thomas had found unexpected satisfaction in his transformation from corporate executive to safety advocate, using his industry knowledge to support reforms that would prevent future tragedies. The financial cost of leaving Garrett Industries had been significant, but the personal cost of remaining would have been unbearable. Most importantly, military. Pilots now flew aircraft equipped with the safety modifications that Dean Rodriguez had died trying to implement. His technical recommendations had been incorporated into mandatory design standards, while his investigative methods had become models for systematic safety analysis throughout the defense industry. On quiet evenings, Zoe would sit on the ranch porch and listen to recordings of her father's voice, not the desperate testimony from his final flight, but the patient explanations he had given her as a young child, learning about aircraft engines. Dean Rodriguez had taught her that understanding problems completely was the first step toward fixing them, and that some battles were worth fighting regardless of personal cost. The helicopter that had brought them together now sat in a place of honor at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, its modified components serving as a permanent reminder that engineering excellence and moral courage could overcome even the most powerful corporate resistance to change. Visitors to the exhibit learned about Captain Dean Rodriguez's sacrifice and his daughter's determination to complete his mission, understanding that aviation safety advances often came from unexpected heroes willing to challenge institutional power. As the desert sun set over the New Mexico landscape, Zoe worked on aircraft components with the same careful precision that her father and grandmother had taught her, carrying forward a family tradition of technical excellence and moral integrity that would influence aviation safety for generations to come. The tools in her hands were the same ones Ruby Sullivan had used during World War II, passed down through 3 generations of people who understood that some knowledge was too important to lose and some fights were too necessary to avoid. Dean Rodriguez had finally given his testimony to Congress, speaking through the evidence he had gathered and the daughter who had inherited his passion for aviation safety. His voice had been heard, his recommendations had been implemented, and his sacrifice had created the systematic changes that would prevent other families from enduring the loss that had shaped Zoe's young life. The truth had proven stronger than corporate power. Justice had prevailed over profit, and a 12-year-old girl's mechanical genius had honored her father's memory while saving countless lives. In the end, the simple act of fixing a broken helicopter had become the catalyst for transforming an entire industry, proving that even the most complex problems could be solved when people chose courage over convenience and truth over comfortable lies. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.